Over the last few years, we've seen a drastic uptick in one singular style of content. Podcasts have blown up to the point where it has become more and more likely for people to make a living off of their interesting conversations. Whether people are listening for the conversations themselves, for background noise, or even just white noise as they doze off to sleep, podcasts have become a part of a lot of people's everyday routine. And take it from a guy who records and edits 2 podcasts a week. Podcasts are the easiest thing ever to make. All you need is a microphone and some basic editing software and you're ready to make a podcast. And that's part of what makes the Midnight Gospel so interesting. It's taking one of the most casual forms of entertainment, podcasts, and mixing it seamlessly with one of the most tedious and demanding forms of entertainment, animation. Building a new, unique story around an already recorded podcast doesn't sound like it would work, but the Midnight Gospel proves that it can, and today I'm going to explain how it pulls this off and why I think the Midnight Gospel is a masterpiece. The Midnight Gospel was created by Duncan Trussell and Pendleton Ward and was released on Netflix on April 20th, 2020. April 20th, of course, is good old 420, which is strongly in line with the trippy visuals and philosophical talks had on the show, and it just so happens to also be Duncan Trussell's birthday. The show follows Clancy, voiced by Duncan Trussell, a spacecaster that goes onto simulated planets to interview and talk with some of the inhabitants. It's essentially Duncan Trussell's podcast, The Duncan Trussell Family Hour, with a fun sci-fi world and story built around it. Most of the dialogue in the show comes directly from the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, giving the show a really casual feel in terms of the conversations. Meanwhile, the trippy animation was handled by Pendleton Ward, the creator of Adventure Time and Titmouse Inc., and it's trippy, beautiful, colorful, just about any adjective you could use to describe peak animation. The show has 1 season with 8 episodes, with a 2nd season not completely out of the question. And with the details out of the way, now we can get into why I think this show is so fantastic. The animation in the Midnight Gospel is incredible. There is so much going on in every scene to the point where it can kind of be a bit overwhelming, but this honestly works in the show's favor. The Midnight Gospel is, in a way, designed to overwhelm the senses while you're watching, because ideally your brain is processing the conversation and these big ideas while also trying to process these crazy visuals. It's a lot to take in, and the animation sort of turns into a metaphor for the conversations being had throughout the series. Pairing big, intimidating ideas like death with shocking and intense imagery is a wonderful way to fully immerse the audience in the themes of each episode. It might be overwhelming at first, sure, but as you watch the Midnight Gospel, the rest of the world can just sort of fade around you, and you can just sit back and take in everything you're seeing and hearing. Now, a slight tangent here, I've heard some people say that to watch the Midnight Gospel you need to be high, but I don't necessarily believe that. Having watched this show multiple times, sometimes high admittedly and other times fully sober, I think that what the Midnight Gospel has to offer can be obtained in either scenario. So if you've held off on watching this show because you thought you had to be high in order to watch it, it's actually not the case. The show just demands your attention, and as an audience member, you have to let yourself get sucked in by the animation and dialogue and not have really any distractions around you. And some people just find it easier to get sucked into something when they're high, and I'll admit, it does help a little bit, but it's definitely not a prerequisite to watching the Midnight Gospel. With that tangent out of the way, let's talk about how the animation in the Midnight Gospel complements the conversations. The conversations in the Midnight Gospel are slow and casual, while the animation is quick and intense. The Midnight Gospel is a show that never really slows down in terms of animation. There is always something going on screen. So as the conversations slow down or go on a tangent, there is always something on screen to engage the audience. Yet somehow, with the amount of things going on in terms of animation, the show never feels nonsensical. Within the context of our world, the things happening on screen seem almost alien, but within the world of the Midnight Gospel, it all makes perfect sense. The show rarely, if ever, stops to acknowledge the craziness happening on screen. It just exists within the craziness, and that's what makes this work so well. So the Midnight Gospel keeps things moving in terms of animation in order to constantly engage the audience. It's a show that demands your full attention and offers something visually unique and beautiful in order to earn that attention from the audience. But the animation helps in one other key area as well. It helps to tell the story. Since most of the show's dialogue is made up of podcast clips, the main portions of the story are carried completely by the animation. One common phrase in visual media I'm sure you've heard is show don't tell, and the Midnight Gospel follows this idea very closely. There is of course some leeway, such as the opening of each episode where Clancy's interacting with things outside of the simulations, but once inside the simulation, the animation takes over as the primary storyteller. And since the animation is pulling the storytelling weight, the characters are left to talk about whatever big, crazy ideas they want to. This balance between storytelling is what makes these clips from the podcast feel natural in the world of the Midnight Gospel. But unfortunately, the conversations can't just feel natural. They also have to be interesting and engaging on their own. And that leads us to my second point. From subjects such as death, meditation, and even magic, the Midnight Gospel gives its audience some fascinating topics to dive into. It takes a special kind of person to make these big topics digestible and somehow funny, and that special person is Duncan Trussell. Like I said earlier, most of the dialogue in the Midnight Gospel comes directly from Duncan Trussell's podcast. And he has a knack for taking these big, intimidating topics and making them fun and understandable. But just the core idea of the Midnight Gospel, taking these conversations from a podcast and mixing them into a larger story, is pretty insane, even if you have someone like Duncan Trussell in charge and leading these interviews or conversations. On paper, it would make far more sense to rewrite what was said in the podcast and essentially try to recapture the magic, but the show has a if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality, which I'm still shocked they were able to pull off in such a satisfying way. Now, they didn't just shove in a bunch of podcast clips, some extra lines are recorded to make the conversations feel more natural within the world of the Midnight Gospel, but the core really is just Duncan Trussell's podcast. You really can't find another show that feels and sounds as natural as the Midnight Gospel, especially when it comes to shows that have this kind of subject matter. Hearing characters have conversations about meditation and having it not come across as preachy or overly technical is an incredible feat. Before I found Duncan Trussell's podcast originally, I always saw these types of conversations about meditation specifically as a way for people to kind of mentally masturbate and just spiritually suck their own dicks. But Duncan Trussell changed my outlook on not only these kinds of conversations, but on meditation as a whole. And the Midnight Gospel takes these conversations from the Duncan Trussell Family Hour to the next level by cutting out a lot of the fluff and really focusing on the most interesting and impactful moments in the conversations. Now, that's not to say that the Duncan Trussell Family Hour is bloated, because it's not. It's just that the Midnight Gospel makes these conversations even easier to understand. Now, I can't talk about the quality of the conversations in the Midnight Gospel without talking about the guests. There are some incredibly fascinating real-life people featured in the Midnight Gospel. Take guest Damien Eccles, for instance, a man falsely accused of murder and placed on death row whose time in prison led him to studying ceremonial magic and becoming ordained in the Rinzai Zen Buddhist tradition. The perspective of someone like Damien Eccles is so unique and fascinating, and the Midnight Gospel is able to capture that perspective by giving the audience just enough information to understand the subject, but leaving enough out so that people are still intrigued to see more from that perspective. The show doesn't overload the audience with information and these gigantic ideas. Instead, it boils them down really simply and has a little bit of fun with them throughout each episode. Another example is the last of the 8 episodes in the series, where Duncan Trussell interviews his late mother, Deneen Fendig. This last episode, Mouse of Silver, features Duncan Trussell's mother, who was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer 4 years prior, talking very plainly and eloquently about death. It's easily one of the most beautiful, inspiring, and heartbreaking things I have ever heard in my life. And hearing Duncan Trussell try to process what his mother is telling him throughout this episode, accompanied by the stunning animation, is something that truly can't be found anywhere else on television. For a show that looks so whimsical and surreal, to feel this emotional and grounded is the key sign that the Midnight Gospel is pulling off something special. Because it's easy to understand and digest what's going on, but it's impossible to forget it once you've seen it.
I know this transfigure, I know, but come on, there's no way to stop the heartbreak. What do you do about that?
You cry. You cry.
With a mixture of stunning, engaging animation and fascinating conversations, The Midnight Gospel creates a truly unique and wonderful experience that can't be found anywhere else. There may be other podcasts that match the level of conversations being had in The Midnight Gospel, and there may be other animated programs that look as good, but there is no show that mixes these two aspects more naturally than The Midnight Gospel, and that's what makes it a masterpiece. If for whatever reason you haven't seen The Midnight Gospel yet, then you are truly missing out on one of the most fantastic pieces of adult animation to ever be put out, and I highly recommend you check it out as soon as possible. Thank you all very much for watching. Like and subscribe to become a cow, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.